is 1937. The nation, struggling to recover from the Great Depression, finds itself in an economic downturn. Unemployment is once again growing, and soup lines are getting longer. In Europe, fascism is on the rise. The growth of Hitler's power is frightening. In Asia, Japan and China are in combat. The whole world is hurtling toward war. This is a time for Americans to buckle down and dance? From coast to coast, Americans of every age and walk of life are abandoning themselves to the merriment of a new dance craze, the Big Apple. Holding hands like children in friendly circles. They're imitating farm animals and bringing back the devil-may-care dance moves of the Jazz Age, the 1920s. In August of 1937, the country went into a recession. That same month, the Big Apple dance craze took off.
Now it's the Big Apple, and everyone's doing it with vigor in Dixie. Dixie dancers wiggle new dance. The Big Apple. The Big Apple is taking the East by storm. New dance said to be sweeping over country. Like wildfire, news of this strange new dance escaped the quarantine of the Carolinas and infected the entire South, spreading north. A dance of joy, like the supreme moment when a darky gets religion, had seeped out of a Negro dance hall called the Big Apple Hall into both the child and adult world of the whites.
This was not the first time that whites were fascinated with the dancing of African American people. It goes way back in history. In the ships that first carried the captured slaves across the sea to ports like New Orleans and Charleston, South Carolina, they were forced to dance to keep in shape and to entertain their captors. Throughout the years of slavery in America, many whites grabbed every opportunity they could to watch the slaves dancing. The slaves themselves were taken by the strange dancing of their white masters, copying their formation patterns and pantomiming their upright postures and snobbish attitudes. They soon adopted partner dancing, which wasn't done in West Africa. Long before the Big Apple, many African American social dances had become national fads. At the turn of the 20th century, there was the cakewalk. In the Jazz Age of the 20s, the African American community of Charleston, South Carolina, gave the world the Charleston. And in the 1930s, the nation saw the rise of swing music and the Lindy hop, soon to be popularized as the jitterbug. As early as the 1830s and continuing right into the 20th century, African American music and dance were imitated to the point of becoming a new form of entertainment, the minstrel show. In minstrelsy, white performers darkened their skin with burnt cork and created exaggerated facial features. The performances were often insulting and demeaning, but at the same time, paradoxically, they could show tremendous admiration, even envy, for African American music and dance styles. Whites had been captivated by black dancers and their music over the course of American history. The Big Apple craze perfectly illustrates this fascination. At the height of its popularity, there were Big Apple music hits and Big Apple dresses. The Big Apple was featured in a Life magazine spread and was even done at the White House. Big Applers in Philadelphia wreaked havoc.
The Big Apple dance craze closed a liquor store here. Dancers in the hall over the store became so enthusiastic doing the Big Apple, the store's ceiling fell. There were no casualties among the whiskey bottles.
The Big Apple dance craze inspired the great cartoonist Rube Goldberg to draw a fantasy machine for teaching the Big Apple in one easy lesson.
Trombone hits vase A, spilling water on sponge B. Weight of water in sponge causes string C to open box, releasing mouse D. Cat E, seeing mouse, raises back and tilts platform F, spilling Big Apple on pupil's head and causing her to go slightly goofy and fall into the natural movements of the Big Apple.
In other words, Rube Goldberg is suggesting that the so-called natural movements of the Big Apple were actually the manifestation of an altered state of consciousness, taking dancers beyond worldly concerns. This is similar to dances of possession and ecstatic dance found in other cultures. Perhaps something about this altered state, this transformation, explains some of the powerful side effects that were attributed to dancing the Big Apple.
The Apple Dance is a good cure for blues.
The Big Apple was seen as energizing and a lifter of spirits. This ad used the Big Apple to sell soft drinks by association with the mood-elevating effects of the dance. The circle of people holding hands suggested the comfort and power in community. This was an impressive image for Americans who were going through hard times. A popular Big Apple postcard is mindful of the demeaning images of minstrelsy, but at the same time, it imaginatively attributes supernatural powers to dancing the Big Apple.
Come on, you killer dillers, this is a jive session. Swing G, Shag G, Susie QQ. There won't be a recession.
It's a primitive concept that dancing can affect the forces of nature, or in this case, the economy. But it does make you wonder if some kind of unconscious wishful thinking wasn't behind the Big Apple dancing craze. Let's get a closer look at the ingredients of this powerful dance. Swing-era America was doing the Lindy hop, the shag, the Susie Q, and pecking. The Big Apple came along and pulled it all together. As this Hollywood version demonstrates, there was always a caller.
Grab your partners for the Big Apple.
There might be a Virginia reel from European American roots. Always some counterclockwise circling. And always some Harlem steps like trucking.
Start trucking.
In this somewhat more authentic version of the Big Apple, we see another formation step of European ancestry, the Paul Jones, in which girls circle and switch partners. It was okay, even fun, to make mistakes in the Big Apple. In a tradition derived from African and African American roots, couples or individual dancers were called to the center of the circle to shine. They improvised to the music, while supporting dancers kneeled down around them and encouraged them by clapping and shouting. Again, dancers do steps from the Lindy hop, which originated in the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem. Some shag, and again, pecking, and trucking. Hip movement was a feature of African and African American dancing. It was considered naughty but fun in the 1930s. In the film Spirit of Youth, we see two other steps that were included in the Big Apple: rubbernecking and picking cherries. A step identical to picking cherries is found in Ghana, West Africa. Almost always, the Big Apple ended with the group raising arms together and shouting a celebratory praise Allah. The phrase was common in the 30s as a sort of whoopee or hallelujah, but it also gives a hint of African Muslim influences in the dance. Religion and partying seem to come together in the Big Apple. Watching the dancers do swing high, swing low, a Charleston step, is Arthur Murray, who built his dance school empire by jumping onto the Big Apple bandwagon early and promoting it like crazy. By promising to make a dancer out of anyone, Arthur Murray grew a franchise of over 100 studios in a couple of years. The Big Apple was inclusive, a dance that everybody could do. With lots of familiar steps, no one need to be left out. Even in Harlem's Savoy Ballroom, home of the world's greatest dancers, the word was that everybody can do it. But in fact, the Saturday Night Big Apple was a performance by some of the most amazing dancers of the day, Whitey's Lindy Hoppers. Whitey himself watches as they perform a version of the Big Apple created by one of his chief dancers, Frankie Manning. Manning was in Hollywood at the time. Whitey wrote to him describing the new dance craze, and Manning sent back an airmail letter with his Big Apple choreography. While the Big Apple phenomenon is all but forgotten today, it lives on among swing dancers. But instead of doing the called Big Apple, most of them are performing Frankie Manning's choreography. The Big Apple is simply the biggest and most beautiful apple on the apple tree, but it's always high and slightly out of reach. It's not completely unattainable, but it is a real prize when someone gets it. In our society, apples stand for all that is wholesome and desirable. An apple a day, as American as apple pie. Well, there is that story about Adam and Eve. It was African-American musicians who first referred to Harlem as the Big Apple, long before the city of New York. Harlem was the place they all aspired to work, the place where they could make their music and make the rent too. The use of the name Big Apple for Harlem spread to African-Americans throughout the rural South, where so many were migrating north. Harlem, the Big Apple, held the promise of a better life. Actually, the Big Apple dance got its name from the African-American nightclub in Columbia, South Carolina, where the dance craze got its start. The local patrons, too, had dreams of a better life. Perhaps the name was music to their ears. The Big Apple building had originally been an Orthodox Jewish synagogue, the House of Peace. Women prayed separately in the balcony, while the men worshiped on the main floor below. When the congregation moved, the building started its new life.
One night, 3 white high school students heard swinging music coming from the building. Dying to see the dancing inside, Billy Spivey and his 2 friends walked right up to the door. The proprietor, Fat Sam, wouldn't let them come in. He shook his head no and said, "You know I can't do that."
Segregation was not just the custom, it was the law.
Fat Sam rubbed his chin. He looked over his shoulder into the dance hall, and his eyes lit on the balcony above. "Well," he said, "as long as you stay up on the balcony and no dancing."
Soon, teenagers came night after night to watch the dancers from the balcony of the Big Apple Club, throwing down coins when the Nickelodeon stopped playing. Afterwards, they practiced the dance they named the Big Apple. By the end of the school year, Columbia's high school and college students were dancing the Big Apple at their senior proms. After school was out, many of these students went to Myrtle Beach, a popular summer beach resort near Columbia. At the Myrtle Beach Pavilion, the Big Apple became the rage, danced day and night by barefoot youngsters. With the influx of visitors to Myrtle Beach, the new dance spread quickly throughout the South in July of 1937. In no time at all, it hit the news media in the North and spread across the country. In addition to word of mouth and news coverage, the dance was spread by traveling Big Apple performance troupes, each claiming to be more authentic than the other. There were both white companies and African American companies. The publicity for the shows reflected the racial stereotypes of the times.
You ain't seen nothing till you see these colored folks do the Big Apple like they do it down in Darktown.
The black touring companies had significant obstacles to traveling because of restrictions on where they could eat or sleep and their poverty. To get to one performance, 5 of the original Big Apple nightclub dancers had to travel in a piece of farm equipment. On the way, 2 of the men lost their lives in a collision. In contrast, the white Big Applers had a charmed experience. A scout from the Roxy Theater in New York City came down to Columbia to hold a Big Apple contest. The lucky winners were invited to a 3-week engagement at the Roxy. They were the toast of the town. Some of the Roxy dancers, like Gene Foreman, stayed on to become show business professionals. Some of them returned south and toured in a show produced by Dan Fitch, a retired white minstrel entertainer who had a long career singing and dancing in blackface. This is what Dan said about the Big Apple.
Why, what they do in the Big Apple, I've been doing all my life.
In other words, he saw the Big Apple dance as a white person's amusing caricature of African American dance. By the 1930s, minstrelsy had been supplanted by vaudeville and film as popular entertainment. But it lived on through handbooks giving amateurs the tools they needed to put on their own home minstrel shows. Perhaps, for some white people, the attraction of doing a dance copied from an African-American nightclub may have been similar to the appeal of doing amateur blackface performances. As in any mass performance, the dancers have license to act in ways they would not ordinarily. They may experience a new sense of abandon and even exultation that is otherwise absent from their lives. This feeling of freedom may have contributed to the popularity of the Big Apple. But the great mystery remains. What inspired the young African-American dancers at the Big Apple nightclub to make up this dance? Many scholars agree that the ring shout is the probable root of the Big Apple. The ring shout was a religious dance that arose when the slaves came to the New World. They had been sold to their new owners without regard for their tribal backgrounds, the languages they spoke, or even their family connections. Thrown together with strangers in slaves' quarters on plantations, they developed a mode of dance worship with time-worn features that were common to all their various African backgrounds. The ring shout was not dependent on a common language or even identical religious beliefs. It was a practice of deeply felt rhythm and movement. The ring shout lifted the slaves' spirits. It helped them cope with the terrible dislocations they had experienced and eased the pain of the brutal conditions they were now living under. It recharged them spiritually and physically. In this illustration of the ring shout from 1862, you can see many of the elements that reemerge in the Big Apple 75 years later. They're moving in a counterclockwise circle. The man in the center is probably of Muslim background, praying to Allah. The people witnessing are on their knees, encouraging the moving dancers, just as they do years later in the Big Apple dance. Hypnotic music and repetitive circular movement transported the participants into an ecstatic state beyond all worldly cares. They believed they had a direct connection with spiritual or ancestral forces and harnessed these for a healing ceremony. The ring shout persisted long after slavery ended. In fact, it was still being practiced in coastal Georgia and South Carolina in the 1930s, as seen in The Emperor Jones with Paul Robeson, a 1932 film. Behind the opening credits, the African origin of the ring shout is suggested by showing African dancers in a circle and then fading right into a circle of the African American ring shout in a church. You'll hear a cry as one of the dancers falls into a state of possession and is escorted safely away. The ring shout continues to be done to this day in one location in coastal Georgia by the McIntosh County Shouters, although the practitioners are elderly and fearful the tradition will die out. Again, we see some features the ring shout has in common with the Big Apple, especially the whole idea of responding to the caller.
Sister Skipper pays close attention to the words of the song. Here, a conversation between God and Eve, and pantomimes the action, Adam picking up leaves to cover his nakedness. The words of the shout songs are not incidental, but contain important meanings ranging from biblical dramas to coded protests against slavery.
Notice how the woman in purple is holding her skirt like the rusty dusty step in the Big Apple. As dancers move in a counterclockwise circle and shout Daniel shout, directions are given to a slave named Daniel so he can avoid getting caught by the master. When the caller says, "Go the other way," they follow closely. Here's a rock step. Here they're imitating a bird. Steps like these, which imitate birds and animals, pantomime everyday activities, or tell stories, are common in African dance. Through the ring shout, they found their way into the Big Apple. Although the ring shout was a religious practice, over time it found its way into secular dance, evolving into the walk around, a finale dance seen here in a Cotton Club show from 1932. When Frankie Manning choreographed his airmail version of the Big Apple for Whitey's Lindy Hoppers in 1937, he opened with a shout step. Although Manning had never seen the Big Apple dance, he apparently connected it to the ring shout, which he had observed during his childhood summers and holidays in Aiken, South Carolina. In his autobiography, Ambassador of Lindy Hop, Manning relates his memory of playing with other children in South Carolina, away from the grown-ups, and doing comical imitations of the minister and congregants they had seen in the church. Perhaps this seems disrespectful, but the youngsters may have been uncomfortable with the display of intense emotions they saw, and this may have relieved their anxiety. It's possible that the young dancers at the Big Apple Club in South Carolina, finding themselves in a church-like setting, also engaged in some playful pantomime of the ring shout they had observed in church. They mixed it with the day's swing music and their favorite jazz steps. Mirroring the originators of the Big Apple dance, Frankie Manning used jazz steps from his Harlem experience and memories from his Southern childhood. It's not surprising that he struck an authentic note with his Big Apple choreography. Fortunately, Frankie Manning's Big Apple is preserved in the film Keep Punching, danced by Whitey's Lindy Hoppers. In 1937, the Big Apple dance craze lifted the spirits of a depressed nation. Each of its steps had a history which may not have been known to the dancers. Still, when the steps came together into a joyous dance, it had the power to bring people together, to laugh and shout and feel confident that better times would come.